joy it is to try to follow Dr. King as a preacher. I used to sit in the service at Ebenezer when I was sharing before, as Reverend Dr. Joseph Roberts was the minister, the pastor there. And I used to just sit there and think, man, what a challenging thing to be able to stand in this pulpit and follow such a icon of the movement in this icon of a church. I actually got to hear one Sunday the Reverend Dr. Joseph Warnock preach a sermon as he was a young minister there under the mentorship of Reverend Dr. Joseph Roberts, and proud to say he's now Senator Joseph Warnock. So happy for him, and not so happy for the congregation there at Ebenezer. He's been in that position since 2005. I know they will certainly miss his role and activity at the church. But what a daunting task to follow, and also Dr. King, but also a daunting task to try to have something to say in the midst of what we've experienced over the past few weeks, and particularly the events that unfolded at the invasion of the Capitol on January 6th. We are in a time where currently fences with razor wire surround our U.S. Capitol. Razor wire that is similar to the razor wire that surrounded the camps in Nazi Germany. And interestingly enough, razor wire that also mimics the razor wire on our southern border of our own country. It's fencing, it's walls, it's wires that have been created by fear, by hate, by trying to exclude, by trying to overpower. That culminated into this event on January 6th. We've seen marches on Washington before. One of the most famous was led by Dr. King himself, where he gave his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. John Lewis was a part of that march and spoke at that speech, at that march, and was encouraged ahead of time not to do this. Was told, John, if you go and you participate in this march, it absolutely is going to lead to violence. And he had certainly experienced violence before, from his time on the bridge in Selma to the freedom rides, the sit-ins in Nashville. And I know that our book club is studying the newest biography of John Lewis. And so you know that those of you who have been a part of that John Lewis sat under the teaching and the mentorship of James Lawson, a professor in Nashville, who relentlessly pursued nonviolence and love as a means of transformation. This had been solidified as John Lewis, the boy from Troy, as Dr. King called him, began working with the movement. And John Lewis said in response to the criticisms about marching on Washington, he said, we will march on Washington, but we are committed to a nonviolent protest, and we cannot and we will not let it become a violent act of hate. I think about that as the leaders of that march made a commitment to not let it become a violent act of hate. And it lets us know that leaders can have a say in what a protest becomes. Leaders that were committed to transformation through decency, through love, through nonviolence, and through truth. Now, we can be shocked, but we can't be surprised that we ended up here on January 6th. The airwaves, the speeches at rallies, the social media have been flooded with hate and bigotry and violence that have awakened and energized a diseased beast in our nation that had only been sleeping, had not been eradicated. As I shared in the Unigram this week, I've turned to the teachings of Dr. Howard Thurman, who was a mentor to Dr. King, He was a teacher, a professor, a pastor, a philosopher, and a mentor to so many young students taking part in the civil rights movement and a move for change out of love. Some have even said without Howard Thurman, there would be no Martin Luther King Jr. And so I turn again to Howard Thurman today because in his book, Jesus of the Disinherited, he dedicates a chapter to hate, followed by a chapter dedicated to love. And in the chapter on hate, he names what he calls the basics of hatred. In the first place, he says hatred often begins in a situation where there is contact without fellowship. And I want you to listen to his words from almost a century ago. Much of modern life is so impersonal that there is always opportunity for seeds of hatred to grow unmolested. Now, I don't know that Dr. Thurman had a prophetic vision of our age of social media, but even in his lifetime, he saw the deterioration of our being together, of our listening to each other, of our empathizing with each other. Certainly, we are connected, but there is no fellowship. And really, the heart of the word fellowship, of being together, of knowing each other as we are known, of being exposed, of being vulnerable, of listening, of empathizing, of being connected in relationship, mind and heart. Thurman goes on to say, in the second place, these contacts without fellowship, this connectedness without fellowship, tends to express in a kind of understanding that is strikingly unsympathetic. I can sympathize only when I see myself in another's place. Unsympathetic understanding is the characteristic attitude governing the relation between the weak and the strong. When we lose fellowship, when we lose listening, when we lose empathy, we lose our ability to transcend ourselves and sympathize with the others. We become what Martin Buber called I-it relationships instead of I-thou. And how certainly this is true, that we have lost the ability to think about the impact of others and how they are feeling. And then Howard Thurman goes on to say, in the third place, in the third basic part of hate, an unsympathetic understanding tends to express itself in the active functioning of ill will. I remember reading that again this week and thinking, now that's the understatement of the year. An unsympathetic understanding tends to express itself in the active functioning of ill will. Certainly we have seen the active functioning of ill will. Maybe we've even participated in active functioning of ill will. And how can we not when we see things that make our blood boil? But this lack of transcending of self leads to these acts of ill will because we lose our moral compass and we get caught up in the hypnosis of individual rightness at the peril of relationships. We find our fellow humans caught up in this hypnosis of hate and abandoning their humanity to act in these inhumane ways. How else can we describe what we've seen with our own eyes over the past few weeks? Fellow humans caught up in the hypnosis of hate and abandoning their own humanity. Now, I know he wasn't officially elected president, but one of my fantasy presidents is Jed Bartlett from the show The West Wing. And I think about a line as I was watching all of this unfold this week that he said in one of the episodes of The West Wing, just simply, they weren't born wanting to do this. Fellow human beings caught up in the hypnosis of hate and abandoning their own humanity. And then Thurman says, in the fourth place, ill will, when it's dramatized in a human being, becomes hatred walking and creeping on the earth. Hatred in the mind and the spirit of the disinherited, as he calls it, is born of great bitterness. Bitterness that's made possible by resentment, which bottled up and distills into this essence of vitality, giving to the individual in whom this is happening this radical and fundamental basis for self-realization. Hatred becomes for us a source of validation for personality. And often hatred can give you a sense of significance. Thurman does say that anger and hatred can be an invitation to awaken and transcend the hypnotic state. That is the hopefulness in this for me, is that hatred can establish a dimension of self-realization that's hammered, as Thurman says, out of the raw materials of injustice. This distinct derivative, this tremendous source of dynamic energy that's provided for us out of our own anger, out of our own tendency toward hate, this thing that's calling us, this hypnosis, this spirit that's calling us to hate, can actually awaken us to see the big picture, to take a step back and see what's going on in our culture. This strange new cunning possesses the mind, and every opportunity for taking advantage, for defeating the enemy and being able to roll back justice like waters is revealed in very clear ways. Anger can be very revealing, very clarifying, and if we use it correctly, very empowering and transforming. Oftentimes, people who talk about emotions will name good emotions and bad emotions, and often bad emotions, the top of that list is anger. But anger can be powerful when it does not lead toward bitterness and hate and violence. One of the salient ways by which we express ourselves in this quality of endurance and resilience that appears so many times in those who allow anger to move them toward love and nonviolent reform. Think about how angry you might have been as you stood in your front yard with a cross burned, as your young family is so frightened by that experience. And think about the resiliency to reach down and remove it and live another day, letting love guide us. But despite all those positive psychological attributes of hatred, hatred can actually, if not used in a positive way, can destroy the core of the life of the hater. Hatred bears deadly and bitter fruit. Thurman says that once hatred is released, it cannot be confined to the offenders alone, and often hatred cannot be controlled once it is set in motion. And above and beyond all else, it must be borne in mind that hatred tends to dry up the springs of creative thought in the life of the hater, so that resourcefulness becomes completely focused on the negative aspects of the environment. So what is the alternative? For us here at the UUCC, we have the alternative, and we turn to the next chapter in Thurman's book, which is all about love. Thurman, as a Christian theologian, uses the example of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus to love your neighbor, but not only love your neighbor, but love your enemy. And the religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central. Someone must love their neighbor directly, permitting no barriers in between. Loving your enemy. I remember growing up and hearing my mom say that if you love your enemy, you will heap coals of fire on their head. I thought, well, why don't I just heap coals of fire on their head instead of loving them? I just skipped that first step in the process. But Thurman points out that in the days of Jesus, those enemies, some of them personal enemies, but some of them social enemies, like the Romans, for instance, for Jews living in that first century world, to love them, to offer love to them, made people often seem weak and even untrustworthy if they were loving the enemy. But it's still the ethic, the central of what Jesus was calling them to do. But before love can operate, there's a necessity for forgiveness. There's an act of injury in an element that is irresponsible and irrational. Thurman writes that no evil deed and no good deed was named by him as an expression of the total mind of the doer. No evil deed represents the full intent of the doer. The evildoer does not go unpunished. Life is its own restraint. but there is a spirit at work in life and in the hearts of men that is committed to overcoming the world. It is universal, knowing no age, no race, no culture, no condition of men, for the privileged and unprivileged alike. If the individual puts at the disposal of the Spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can live effectively in the chaos of the present high destiny of who we are. What hopeful words in a time where we have seen such hate and such hopelessness and such despair, to know that love can operate and can transform our culture around us. And this is the essence of our campaign this month that we are kicking off. We are acknowledging in this age of self-protection and raised fist of anger that love can open our arms. Our anger can be an opportunity for self-transcendence, to see beyond the symptoms of the disease that is plaguing our nation, and at the UUCC, we will courageously stand up against hatred and violence. We will be the vaccine to this hatred and violence, even when it is disguised as patriotism. We will not be silent as long as there is injustice and people are oppressed and hurting. We will risk being mocked to voice our concern and protection for our world, our climate, and our web of existence around us. We will engage in activities that may be troubling to the status quo when the status quo needs to be troubled and disoriented. We will overcome by our work here at the UUCC. So it is my hope in the UUCC of who we are and all that we do, we will go forward with open arms of love. Love has to guide us, or we will only be participating in the ill will and the destruction. So let us accept our anger and our uneasiness, befriend it and listen to it, and hear it as invitations to transcend ourselves and transform our culture around us. Let us tune our ears to the beckoning call of love and know deep in our hearts, in all that we do, love will guide us.